Good evening with Alaska weather. I'm David Kramer. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get updates to the forecast, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call the new weather info line, 1-885-937-4977. Starting off, we want to take a look at some of the heavier rain we do expect around south central Alaska. Heaviest amounts will be around Prince William Sound, Whittier, and Cordova, both expecting to see between 4 and 6 inches, and that is from this afternoon through Sunday evening. Valdez up to 3 to 4 inches, Talkeetna 2 to 3 inches, and Anchorage 1 to 1.5 inches expected. Now we do also have a flood watch out for the greater Anchorage area from Indian through Eklutna. That's going to be in effect from late tonight through late Sunday night. Fire weather update. We are looking at minimal thunder activity, so we are going to potentially see some lighter or isolated thunderstorms throughout the weekend, but much diminished from what we have been seeing over the last week or so. Temperatures are going to be at or below normal, and we do have the Yukon Flats being the only area that's not seeing some of the higher humidity levels returning to the area, still somewhat dry out by the Yukon Flats. And then outlook, we are expecting continuing to see higher chances for precipitation and higher chances to have lower than normal temperatures for much of mainland Alaska. Taking a look at our fire danger map for tomorrow on Saturday, we do have high fire danger still at the Seward Peninsula and the northwestern portions of the interior, then up along the Arctic coast for the western portions as well. But much of the state has gone back down to low for the fire danger with some of the rain that we've seen coming back in through much of mainland Alaska. Let's look at our satellite imagery starting off out west. We'll look at a low pressure system near the western Aleutian Islands. And as we watch this again, we can watch the frontal system associated with this low moving through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, bringing rain to those areas. Out over mainland Alaska, we'll watch another low move through that's bringing rain throughout much of the mainland. And then finally a weaker low out by the Panhandle area, just to the south of the area, that's bringing some lighter showers to the Panhandle. As we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, we'll go back to that system out west. Low pressure out by the western Aleutians, frontal system extending through the southern Bering Sea out through the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain throughout all of these areas and starting to push rain towards southwest Alaska as well. Out over the mainland, we are seeing rain from southwest through south central and up into the interior, with that heaviest rain along the North Gulf Coast, especially around the Prince William Sound area. Up in the eastern portions of the interior, we're still going to see some areas of smoke lingering throughout today, and then up in the Brooks Range, some isolated rain showers. Along the Arctic coastline, we are expecting to see fog all the way from Kaktovik through the west coast down through the Bering Strait and including Kotzebue Sound. Way down in southeast, we are going to see some rain showers from that weaker low out over the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska. As we move into tonight, lingering rain showers out over the Panhandle, and then we're going to see continued rain through much of the southern portion of mainland as that low pressure system that we were tracking by the western Aleutians will have moved much farther to the east by the eastern Aleutian Islands, with the frontal system pushing into Bristol Bay. That's going to bring rain throughout much of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and the southern mainland, with that southerly flow coming in off the Gulf towards south central Alaska. In the interior, we're going to see rain throughout most of the locations, with some areas of smoke in the eastern portions of the interior hanging on through much of the night. As we move up along the Arctic coastline, continuing to see areas of fog all along the coast, down through the west coast through the Bering Strait area. As we move into Saturday, our system that we've been tracking in the Bering is going to push closer towards southwest Alaska, with its front moving through the Gulf of Alaska, bringing continued rain for the central and eastern Aleutians, extending through southwest Alaska and south central Alaska, still seeing that southerly flow off of the Gulf, bringing in that heavier rainfall to south central. Then out by the Panhandle area, we're going to see some continued rain showers out there. As we move into the interior, far eastern locations, we'll have the chance to see some isolated thunderstorms in the afternoon hours on Saturday. Up in the Brooks Range, we're going to see more rain, and then along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see some areas of fog. Finally, on Sunday, we'll have a colder system coming in from the west, bringing rain to the west coast of the state with some snow behind it. And then out over mainland Alaska, we're going to see rain showers throughout much of the mainland, extending down into south central Alaska. And then our old front will have had a low form in the northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, and the trough from that will be bringing in some heavier rain finally to the Panhandle area with some flow off of the Gulf of Alaska. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see some areas of fog, and then down by the Aleutians, we're going to have some ridging moving in, keeping some fair conditions for the Aleutian Islands and southern portions of the Bering Sea, including the Pribilof Islands. Taking a look now at our temperatures starting on Saturday morning, lows out over the Panhandle area dropping down into the lower 50s, and then out over south central Alaska dropping into the lower to mid 50s, a little bit colder in the Copper River Basin, Glen Allen getting down to 49 degrees. Saturday afternoon highs in the Panhandle area getting up into the lower 60s in the south, and then closer towards 60 as we get farther to the north. Staying a little cooler there at Yakutat, only getting up to 57 degrees. South central Alaska getting into the mid to upper 50s most locations, with Kodiak getting up to 60. Sunday morning lows for the Panhandle dropping down to the lower 50s, and then in south central Alaska dropping down into the lower to mid 50s, but as we get closer towards the Copper River Basin, dropping down into the 40s as well as at Valdez. Sunday afternoon highs in the Panhandle getting up towards 60 degrees in southern locations, and in the upper 50s as we get farther to the north, into the mid to upper 50s for south central Alaska, and 62 degrees for Kodiak. Up in the interior, Saturday morning lows going to drop down to around 50 degrees. As we get farther to the west, going to drop into the upper 40s, and then along the west coast in the lower 40s. Along the Arctic coastline, dropping down to near freezing for many of the eastern locations, and in the mid 30s for places out west. Saturday afternoon highs in the interior get up into the mid 60s, getting up to near 50 in western locations of the North Slope, but only in the 40s for the eastern locations. Down along the west coast of the state, getting up into the 50s most locations. Sunday morning lows dropping down into the lower 50s for the interior, down into the 30s for the eastern North Slope, and down to the lower 40s for the western North Slope, and down through much of the west coast as well. Sunday afternoon highs in the interior getting up into the lower 60s, and then into the 50s along much of the Arctic coastline, and lower 50s for much of the west coast as well. Saturday morning lows dropping down to near 50 degrees for southwest Alaska, and into the 40s for the Aleutians. Saturday afternoon highs for southwest getting up into the 60s for interior locations, and the upper 50s along the coast, and then near 50 degrees for the Aleutians. Sunday morning lows dropping down into the 50s for the southwestern portions of the state, and into the mid 40s for the Aleutian Islands as well as the Pribilof Islands. Sunday afternoon highs getting up into the lower 60s, especially in interior locations of southwest Alaska. Still a little bit cooler along the coast in the mid 50s there. And then in the lower 50s for much of the Aleutian Islands, 53 for St. Paul. Moving into our climate forecast for the 6 to 10 day forecast for temperatures, we do see a bullseye out over southwest Alaska indicating that there are high likelihoods to see below normal temperatures in the 6 to 10 day forecast for southwest, and then the lower than normal temperatures for much of the rest of mainland Alaska and Panhandle as well. That's going to continue in the 8 to 14 day forecast as well, and then higher chances to see above normal precipitation throughout Alaska.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start with a quick look at our flying weather Saturday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands with the system moving through the area, we do have widespread IFR conditions that are starting to make their way into Kodiak Island as well as southwest Alaska. For the Gulf of Alaska and South Central, we do have a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions, and then down in the Panhandle, primarily seeing MVFR conditions. MVFR is also going to move up through the rest of southwest Alaska as well as through much of the interior. And then along the Arctic coastline, much of the North Slope should be VFR, but as we get by Utqiagvik and areas to the west along the coast, expecting to see a mixture of MVFR and IFR. Then on Saturday afternoon, still going to see some MVFR up along the northwestern portions of the Arctic coastline. Down through the interior, still seeing MVFR conditions that will extend through southwest and south central Alaska. Down in southwest, we will see some areas of IFR as well that will extend out through much of the southeastern Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. Out for the Gulf of Alaska, we'll see some IFR extending up through the North Gulf coastline, and then MVFR conditions for the Panhandle. Moving into Sunday morning, going to stick with primarily MVFR conditions out over the Panhandle, with some IFR conditions starting to move in from the west towards areas of Yakutat and starting to make their way towards Sitka. Then in south central Alaska, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected, with IFR primarily for southwest Alaska that will extend through the Alaska Peninsula. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian is going to see a mixture of VFR and MVFR conditions, with the exception of areas farther to the east that will see IFR. Some areas of IFR extending into the western portions of the interior, but central and eastern should be primarily VFR. Then up along the Arctic coastline, primarily VFR, but some areas along the coast could see some MVFR conditions. Sunday afternoon, we are going to see primarily VFR conditions for the Arctic coastline. MVFR conditions extending once again through much of the interior. Eastern areas, however, should be VFR. Down in south central Alaska, a mixture of MVFR and IFR, and that will be true down through the Panhandle as well. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, a mixture of VFR, MVFR with some isolated areas of IFR. For our pass conditions starting up north, AKwx should be VFR dropping down to MVFR in the afternoon, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be IFR throughout the day on Saturday. Raining will start off MVFR and then drop down to IFR. Windy should be IFR throughout the day. Isabel should be MVFR throughout the day Saturday, as well as at Mentasta and Tanita. Then for Portage, IFR conditions are expected all day Saturday, and Chilkoot and White should both be MVFR all day Saturday. For our freezing levels, we have some areas of warmer air coming in towards the Kodiak Island and Alaska Peninsula areas, with freezing levels up to as high as 14,000 feet. Then some colder air out by the Panhandle with freezing levels as high as 8,000 feet expected. For our icing, primarily up to the north, we are going to see some areas over the northern interior and central Brooks Range above 7,000 feet. Then over the northwest coastline of mainland Alaska, above 2,000 feet is expected. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is just south of the Alaska Peninsula out of a westerly direction up to as high as 105 knots, out over the peninsula dropping down to around 90 knots. Then out over the eastern portions of the interior, we're going to see westerly winds up to as high as 100 knots, becoming northerly over the Panhandle, getting near 90 knots as we get to the southeastern locations. And then out over the Bering Sea, northerly winds 65 to 80 knots expected. For 9,000 feet, strongest winds once again are going to be south of the Alaska Peninsula, getting up to as high as 60 knots in areas to the south, but closer towards 45 as we get near to the Alaska Peninsula. Out over the Bering Sea, northerly winds around 35 knots expected through the Pribilof Islands. And then as we get over the southern portion of the mainland, we're going to see southwesterly winds 35 knots by Bristol Bay, 45 knots as we get closer towards the Copper River Basin. Eastern portions of the interior, westerly winds are expected there, up to as high as 30 knots. And then northern portions of the Panhandle are going to see west to southwest winds around 30 knots there as well. Dropping us down to 3,000 feet, we're still seeing a similar pattern where we have the strongest winds south of the Alaska Peninsula around 50 knots. As we get nearer to the Alaska Peninsula itself, 35 to 40 knots are expected, still out of that westerly direction. Eastern Aleutians, northwesterly winds 30 knots, and then northerly winds over the Pribilof Islands around 30 knots there. As we look out over the mainland, calmer winds through much of the mainland Alaska, but when we get down to the southern portions, we're going to see some stronger winds near Prince William Sound out of a south-southeast direction around 35 knots there, and 40 knots out of a southwesterly direction out over the Gulf. Up by Kaktovik area and areas to the northeast, southeasterly winds 25 knots. Finally, for our turbulence out over the Copper River Basin area, below 5,000 feet is expected, and then down by the Alaska Peninsula, below 5,000 feet is expected there as well.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie Haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRUS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRUS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRUS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So, how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies, maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So, tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, uh, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So, then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So, it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So, let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 or 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves two of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices. And so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across like large spaces or even small cities. So I notice here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs, so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations. And you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad. And this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a half inch. And I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side. And I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRaz. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoraz.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year, but if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers, some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report, a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRaz. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great. Yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at our ice edge. The main ice pack does look to continue to melt for the next several days. And then out over the Chukchi Sea area, we do have a low moving in on Sunday. That's going to be a little bit uncharacteristic. It should be a colder low, bringing in some colder air from the west and some stronger winds with it. Expectation with that is the ice edge should retreat 10 to 20 nautical miles by mid next week. And since it is uncharacteristic, our sea ice analysts are going to continue to monitor that low pretty carefully out over the Chukchi Sea area. Down in southeast Alaska on Saturday, we are going to see some southerly winds in the inside waters, 10 to 15 knots in southern locations, getting up to as high as 25 knots by Lynn Canal. Out over the Gulf waters, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots in the eastern portions, and then southerly winds 15 knots up north. On Sunday, we are going to see southerly winds in the inside waters, 15 to 20 knots, becoming southeasterly 25 in Lynn Canal. Out over the eastern portions of the Gulf, southerly winds 25 knots, becoming southeasterly 30 knots up north. For south central Alaska on Saturday, out over the Gulf, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots are expected, southeast 15 in Prince William Sound. Cook Inlet, seeing southerly winds 15 knots, and then west of the Barren Islands, we're going to see southeast winds 20 knots. On Sunday, in the Gulf waters, in the northeastern portions, easterly winds 30 knots, becoming southerly 35 as we get closer towards Montague Island, and then southwesterly winds in the western Gulf 25 to 30 knots. In Prince William Sound, southeasterly winds 30 knots, and then in Cook Inlet, southerly winds 15 to 20 knots are expected. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Saturday, primarily going to see southwest winds 20 to 25 knots on the Pacific side and 20 to 25 knots on the Bering side as well. And then in Shelikof Strait, variable winds 10 knots. Sunday, we're going to see primarily westerly winds at all locations, 25 to 30 knots. Seas getting up to as high as 11 feet, highest on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands, primarily westerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutians. On Saturday, 20 to 25 knots, becoming more northerly by the western Aleutians, still around 20 knots. Then on Sunday for the Aleutians, primarily westerly winds 25 knots by the eastern Aleutians and 10 to 15 knots for the central and western Aleutians. So look down the west coast of the state on Saturday. Most locations are going to see northerly winds, lighter up north, 10 to 15 knots north of Hooper Bay, down by Nunavik Island, 20 knots there, as well as at St. Matthew Island, and 25 knots for the Pribilofs. South of Nunavik Island, however, going to be a little different. Easterly winds 20 knots expected. For Sunday along the west coast, switching to become a lot more westerly, 15 to 20 knots up north, 20 to 25 knots around Nunavik Island, and then St. Matthew and the Pribilof Islands both seeing winds around 30 knots. Along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see easterly winds 10 knots or 15 knots dropping down to 10 for the northwest coast, and then down by the Bering Strait around 15 knots, a little bit more variable. For Sunday, continuing to see easterly winds along the Arctic coastline 10 to 15 knots, becoming southerly along the west coast around 20 knots. Recap of tonight's weather. We do have our frontal system moving through the Bering Sea, pushing rain into the Bering, Aleutian Islands, and into southwest Alaska and Kodiak Island. For mainland Alaska, we are going to see rain through much of the interior and down through south central, with some of the heaviest rain for south central and specifically in the Prince William Sound area. We do have a flood watch out for the greater Anchorage area from Indian to Eklutna starting late tonight through late Sunday night. Up in the interior, especially in eastern locations, we're also going to see some of the lingering smoke in the area. And then along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see areas of fog from Kaktovik all the way down the west coast through the Bering Strait area, including the Kotzebue Sound area. Then down in the Panhandle, we're going to see some isolated rain showers. For Saturday, continuing to see rain showers in the Panhandle. And then as our frontal system pushes through the Gulf of Alaska, going to continue to see rain throughout the Gulf and much of the southern mainland. That's going to extend up into the interior as well. And the eastern portions of the interior in the afternoon hours could see the potential for some isolated thunderstorms. Going to see rain continuing for central and eastern portions of the Brooks Range. And then up along the Arctic coast, we'll see areas of fog. And then as we look at our main system that was pushing through the Bering Sea, that's going to move closer towards the Bristol Bay area, continuing to bring rain to southwest Alaska, as well as the eastern Bering, Pribilof Islands, and then the Aleutians through the central Aleutian Islands. As we look into Sunday, ridging will have started to move into the Bering Sea and Aleutians, starting to give some fair weather conditions for the Aleutian Islands and the Pribilofs. However, out over mainland Alaska, widespread rain is expected with lower than northern Gulf, helping to bring in more moisture and heavier rain to the Panhandle area. Continued rain for the mainland, and then a colder system coming in from the west, bringing in some rain to the west coast. Up along the Arctic coastline, we do expect to see continued areas of fog.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.